Hello, everyone. I'm meteorologist Sean Sublett, and welcome to Across the Sky, our national Lee Enterprises weather podcast. Lee Enterprises has print and digital news operations in 77 locations across the country, including at my home base at the Richmond Times-Dispatch in Richmond, Virginia. Two of our co-hosts, Kirsten Lang at the Tulsa World and Joe Martucci at the Press of Atlantic City, had other commitments this week, so I'm joined by Matt Holliner, who covers our Midwest locations from his office in suburban Chicago. Hey, Matt, how are things there?
Doing pretty good. The calendar has flipped to September. I always say this, but it seems like every year goes by faster and faster than the last. And now here we are talking about, well, meteorological fall, at least. We're not officially the official astronomical fall yet, but meteorological fall. It's September, and the weather is still pretty extreme and active in many places. I guess to be fair, we are recording this September 1st. The only thing that hasn't been that active is hurricane season so far. We finally got Danielle to form today, but I would never have bet that we would go the entire month of August, first time in 25 years, without a named storm. I would not have put money on that, but that actually happened.
I don't think any of us would have. I mean, we still expect it to be active, and there's a lot of hurricane season ahead of us. And by the time this actually airs, we'll see how busy it ends up.
Knock on wood.
But yeah, we've been lucky, I think, at this point, or fortunate at least. But hurricane season is still going to go on for a while, and of course, that's one of the classical high impact weather environmental disasters. And so, managing weather disasters and emergencies is more important than ever, especially in a time of information overload. Right. September is actually National Preparedness Month. So it's a good time to talk about being ready for environmental disasters. With that, our guest today is Ashley Morris, Emergency Management Planner in Baltimore County, Maryland. Among the numerous roles in that position, she formulates and maintains all emergency plans for the county and coordinates with others in adjacent jurisdictions as needed. This also involves public outreach and education on what to do when environmental and other hazards strike. Before that, she held emergency management positions in suburban DC and in Texas. She also volunteered at the National Weather Service office in Lubbock. Ashley got her master's and bachelor's degrees in geosciences from Texas Tech. Ashley, thanks for joining us on the Across the Sky podcast.
Yeah, happy National Preparedness Month. Super excited to be here September 1st on the first day of Preparedness Month, so we can really push the importance of emergency preparedness and being ready for disaster. And once again, thanks for having me.
Great having you here, Ashley. Thanks so much. So let's start with the overview, the top-down view. A lot of folks probably don't know what an emergency manager actually does. They may have some inkling, but could you give the relatively Cliff's Notes version of what the main tasks are for an emergency manager?
Absolutely. So I always like to make the joke that when I go and see my dentist or my hairdresser or whoever, and they're always asking, oh, well, what do you do? And I say emergency management. And they kind of look at me funny, like, what's that? So I always like to make that joke and kind of use platforms like this to educate on what emergency management is. And so being an emergency manager is kind of a fancy word of being a disaster manager, okay? So we are in all things disaster preparedness, disaster response, disaster recovery, and disaster mitigation. So preparing for the disaster, getting ready, taking actions before disasters happen. And then when a disaster is forecasted, or when we have a good feeling that a disaster is coming to approach, we take action. We help manage the disaster. We assemble resources. We help our first response personnel respond to the disaster. And then after that, we obviously help our community recover from the disaster. We provide housing, food and water, resources, information to make sure that we can rebuild and hopefully rebuild better. And then lastly, mitigation. So we're trying to prevent disaster. We're taking a look at what we're at risk of, and we're trying to be active in completing projects that either minimize damage from future disasters or prevent them altogether. And so it's a very big and busy duty of emergency managers, not only for cities and counties, but also for states and the federal government as well.
Got it. So do you have a recent example or a hypothetical example of something that you've managed recently that you could kind of walk people through how the process goes, and the time scales and that kind of a thing?
Sure. So, like I mentioned, probably 80% of the time we're working on preparedness or getting ready. So, we're writing emergency plans, we're having meetings with all of our stakeholders. For me, I work on a county level, so we're meeting with our county fire department, our police department, our DPW department, even other departments like economics and permits, and all the other people who work in government are involved in our planning processes, because as we know with COVID and then other storms and hurricanes and things like that, when you're going through response and recovery, you need everyone. You need permits at the table so they can help with rebuilding and zoning and things like that. You also need DPW to help with closing roads or debris management. And so a majority of the time we're spending talking to partners, building partnerships, writing plans, practicing disaster scenarios, and getting ready. Recently, I guess over the past year, we had a coastal flood event. So leading up to the coastal flood event that we had last fall, we would brief our partners on the weather coming in, the weather forecast, the impact, what the flooding looked like. And then when we got right up to about 12 hours out, we would actually open up our emergency operations center, bring all of our partners in the emergency operations center and coordinate or decision make all of the actions, trying to keep tabs on how bad the flooding is. Do we need to close roads? Do we need to evacuate? What information do we need to get out, etc. And so that's a little bit of mix of what preparedness looks like before, and then also what response looks like when we actually have an incident coming in.
That sounds like a logistical nightmare. I mean, it really does. So you understand the need for somebody to manage and oversee how the resources to manage this are done the best. So are you actually working for the county?
Yes. So emergency management is really unique in the fact that we actually have different levels. So we have emergency management sometimes at a city level. If not at a city, the county will have an emergency management office. And then you also have state and federal as well. I work for the county, and so we actually coordinate all the county departments and county government to make sure that we continue to provide government services directly to our residents. During an incident, when we run out of resources or we need additional help, we would reach out to the state emergency management department, who could provide us additional resources around the state. And if it's bad enough, then we would declare, reach up to the state, they would declare, reach up to the Fed, and then try to get assistance from FEMA. And so, like I always like to bring up to everyone, disasters start and end local. So your county and your city emergency management office is the first line of defense when we have weather-related disasters and incidents.
Yeah, and Ashley, does every county in the US have an emergency manager, or are there some counties that do not? And then typically in a counties, for the counties that do have emergency managers, if that's all or not, how many people are on that emergency management team?
That's a great question. I believe every county is supposed to have someone designated to that role. Depending from county to county, state to state, your professionalism or who you dedicate to be that is different. So working in Texas, I know a lot of the time, rural Texas counties would typically have that power sit at the county judge level. And the county judge would have the authority to be that emergency manager for the county. However, the county judge also had the authority to pass it on to a fire chief or hire an emergency management director if they saw fit. And so it's very interesting because you can kind of go around the country and see different formulations of how local level emergency management is set up. Sometimes judge, sometimes first response, sometimes county office. You would typically think that larger counties and jurisdictions would have established offices. They would all be emergency management professionals, and you would have multiple emergency managers, but that's actually not the case. Some metro areas actually only have one or two people dedicated to that, and it's very, very high workload for them to take on all of those things that I described.
Yeah, especially since the weather just seems to be getting more and more extreme. There are just more and more events happening in more places. I mean, over the course of the last month is just a great example of the numerous flash flooding events that have been occurring. I mean, that's something that we've been seeing, of course, over the last 10 years, just more flash flooding events and becoming more extreme as well. And so I imagine that there are places that where the workload has gone up And so there's probably been some reevaluation in some places where, they were able to get by with a smaller number of people in the past. But I imagine that's changing now with climate change, just the amount of extreme weather that we're now seeing.
We're really trying to push for that. With the addition of the threat environment that we have, all of the complicated new threats, not only with climate change and some of the additional weather-related hazards, but also, like I mentioned before the show, cyber attacks, and then some of the other threats that we have, we really are trying to professionalize emergency management, and we're trying to push for not only standardization in who we're hiring to do emergency management, so looking at people who are data-driven, can use technology, can be proactive in assessing stuff, but also looking for investment in programs like you mentioned. So trying to push for more staffing at a local level, trying to establish individual offices with budgets, those things. Because currently the way that the disaster system is set up in the country, like I mentioned, disasters start and end local. So the success and the protection of your residents really does rely on how well your local level emergency management program is operating, funded, and staffed.
So to that end, as Matt alluded to, the growing populations, very high impact weather, looking at emergency management as a vocation and how it has changed the last 10, 20 years. Have you seen a big onset of the professionalism of this type of work, as opposed to a kind of a cobbling together of resources? Because from where I said, I'm not deep into this level of emergency management, but what I have noticed over the last 10 or 20 years is a lot of meteorologists have moved into emergency management, since weather disasters are typically one of the key disasters that are out there. So how would you say that emergency management has changed over the past 10, 20 years or so?
I definitely would agree with you in the sense that I think our field is rapidly growing, and we expect it to grow, especially after COVID. But with all of these onset of these flooding and hazards and hurricanes and all of these disasters we're dealing with, I think the current trend is you see urban is growing faster. So urban offices that are already pretty staffed are getting more staff and more funding and things like that. Rural is also growing, but I think there's probably a slower growth rate there. Like I mentioned, in terms of professionalism, some states are actually putting out training standards, and we're trying to kind of define if emergency managers should go to college or come out of first response or whatever that looks like. But that's been kind of stagnant, I'd say, for the past few years. Once again, we're trying to push for that, but we'll see where that actually goes. You're 100% right about meteorologists joining emergency management. I think it is so important to have STEM-based folks come into our field because, like I mentioned with the evolving hazards, we really need data-driven, critical thinking people. And some of the best meteorologists and some of the best emergency managers that I've seen have the ability to do that. They understand the science, they are accustomed to looking at data and applying it and things like that. And so emergency management is a great fit for any meteorologists or people looking at wanting to actually get a hands-on approach at solving world's problems while implementing the science you learn at university.
And Ashley, could you talk about your relationship with the National Weather Service? Because it seems like emergency managers are very closely tied with the National Weather Service. Now, I imagine if you have a meteorologist on staff, somebody who has some meteorology experience, it might be a little bit different. But it seems like emergency management is very closely tied and has lots of communication with the National Weather Service. I've noticed that when I typically interact with emergency managers, being in the media, I'm usually on what's called NWS chat. And emergency managers are in there. It's kind of a way that both broadcast meteorologists, people in the media, but also emergency managers can communicate with the National Weather Service during active weather, like during severe thunderstorm warnings, tornado warnings. But besides that, during an actual event, what about, leading up to an event? What are the kind of conversations that emergency managers have with the National Weather Service?
Having a solid partnership with your NWS office is extremely important if you're a local level emergency manager. I try to go around and preach that to as many emergency management offices and partners as possible. When I first started in the field, I went to school originally to study meteorology and do NWS, but then fell in love with the fact that you could come into emergency management and actually, do evacuations and do all of those actions to keep people safe. But coming in from that background, I already understood what NWS was. And so I was very surprised to know not a lot of emergency management offices were 100% sure of what NWS does, what services they provide, how they can help. And so I really tried to work on spreading that and really promoting that your partnership with NWS is critical, not only for before the disaster, for things like hazard assessment, taking a look at storm history, using that storm data for your hazard mitigation plans or your emergency plans or your THIRAs, your threat assessments, but also leading up. So like you mentioned, getting briefings from NWS, from professional meteorologists that are, academically schooled in meteorology. You're not looking at apps. You have solid information from professionals for that. You're also getting graphics, so public information help, sharing that on social media from them. Also, forecast information specific to your first response needs, whether it be on NWS chat, call, briefing. They provide critical information that will really allow you as an emergency manager or a first responder to be able to apply that weather information to whatever operations you have in the field involving your disaster response or your recovery operations.
Yeah, I think that's so critical, Ashley, because so many folks really, they don't know what the weather service offices are doing. They know they're kind of there, but they're not sure exactly what they're doing on a day-to-day basis and what their precise role is when hazardous weather is moving in. We're running up against the clock here. We're going to take a little bit of a break. Then we'll come back and have more with Ashley Morris, Emergency Management Planner in Baltimore County. This is the Across the Sky podcast.
Make a difference. Relish a great work-life balance. Enjoy generous benefits and competitive pay. Go home each night feeling fulfilled by your work. Work for an employer of choice. Work for Blue Ridge Hospice. We're always looking to hire compassionate RNs, CNAs, or anyone interested in office or thrift shop work. We've been your not-for-profit community hospice since 1981. Visit our website for more information or to apply today at blueridgehospice.org. That's blueridgehospice.org. Blue Ridge Hospice is an equal opportunity employer.
And welcome back to the Across the Sky podcast. I'm meteorologist Sean Sublett, along with my colleague Matt Hollander in Chicago. Our guest is Ashley Morris, Emergency Management Planner in Baltimore County, Maryland. So Ashley, let's talk a little bit about another aspect of the job. There's the planning and execution, but there's also an educational aspect to this as well, helping people understand what the threats are long before they happen. So how much kind of public outreach do you do?
As much as possible. So like I mentioned before, we're very busy with writing plans, doing exercises, getting out in the community, doing the outreach, but also the response and recovery aspects. But it's so important that we go out and we actually make relationships, not only with nonprofits and our community groups, but also with individual residents. Emergency management is a very hidden field and office. And so not a lot of people in the country understand that there's more than FEMA. So that is really challenging, if you can imagine, if I have a disaster and I'm trying to provide shelter and information and help to my people, but they have no idea that I exist and that I'm trying to do that for them. So community outreach is a great way to make sure that we're not only highlighting our office and we're showing off what their local level emergency managers are doing for them, but we're also trying to give them tools to where they can better prepare for disaster, be more ready for disaster, get supplies, get information, and then also have a better chance of surviving a disaster, but also recovering from a disaster. Because we all know that recovery is an extremely long and emotionally painful process, and we really want people to understand and be prepared for that if they need to go through that.
Yeah, the education process is, so important, getting the word out before the disaster strikes. That way people are better prepared to handle it and then better prepared to handle the recovery as well. One thing I'm curious about, is there a sharing of resources among emergency management offices? For example, if one particular county is hit really hard by, let's say, an extreme flooding event, do neighboring counties sometimes pitch in? Do emergency managers go and share resources in certain situations? Or is it very much more compartmentalized and everybody just focuses on their county and there's really not a lot of sharing? Or is there quite a bit of sharing of resources when one particular area gets really hard hit? How much do emergency managers collaborate in those situations?
A ton. So a lot of our emergency management processes, even when you're looking at disaster and getting assistance from FEMA and federal assets, we're all about sharing. So trying to reach out to jurisdictions that are not having their own incidents or disaster impacts and bringing in their search and rescue teams, their public works tractors or supplies or whatever they could possibly have, their outreach people, their volunteers. So that's a huge thing. And it's even more important for us to actually reach out now, Blue Sky Day, when we don't have a disaster, and make formal mutual aid agreements with these jurisdictions so that we have a better understanding legally and also a better understanding of their capabilities so we know what to count on when we have that disaster. Besides mutual aid, I will say first response does that every day. So there are some jurisdictions that when they have structure fires or small emergencies, they're actually getting engines and supplies from neighboring fire departments. Same with the police world. So mutual aid is heavily used in first response, but also in emergency management. And as you know, the bigger the disaster, the more stuff you need. And during a big disaster, we could have resources from across the country.
Yeah, to that end, about how big is your department there? I mean, Ashley, is it 2-3 people for the county? Is it a dozen? Is it 2 dozen? I mean, how big of an operation do you have there? I mean, it's hard for a lot of people to even wrap their heads around what this even looks like in terms of planning and operations.
Yeah, so our Office of Emergency Management is currently within our fire department. And so we fall under the fire department structure. We currently have 5 staff. We have a director, I'm the emergency planner, and then we also have a continuity of government operations planner. And then we also have a special events lieutenant as well as a GIS specialist. So about 5 of us who are collaborating and working together to do all things preparedness, response, and recovery.
All right, so we talked a little bit about about physical hazards, right? Whether they're weather disasters, environmental disasters, or sometimes they're man-made disasters. But you mentioned at the outset a little bit about cyber disasters. And I know this is one of these things that can spawn nightmares for people. What kind of plans do you have? What kind of things are you on the lookout for? And what kind of responses would you have on some kind of a cyber attack?
So I will say, I think cyber and the evolution of cyber is a hazard that does absolutely keep a lot of emergency managers up at night for the fact that it is an evolving threat. Obviously, hurricanes and other disasters, they still worry us and they're still a concern, but because we've kind of been responding to them or there's an annual threat of them, it's a little different. With cyber, that's kind of a new threat. So some of us have had to completely learn and reassess OIT programs, technology, how government infrastructure is set up. And so a lot of the planning process is actually just reaching out to our OIT partners, bringing them into planning meetings, and then learning a little more from the subject matter experts about how things work, where are the vulnerabilities, and what they need. Similar to any other kind of disaster, if a cyber attack was to happen, they would actually lead the response. They are the professionals in all things IT. So they're going to know how to fix it, when to fix it, and they're going to need to know what to fix. They would lead our emergency operations center, and then we could also provide them any kind of resources, tools. If we need to order something from the state, we would always sit in that coordination or that communication role as a support to them in their overall operations. But I will say, looking at cyber, government runs a lot on electronic services. And so our biggest concern always with cyber and for government planning is just making sure that we can provide continuity of government services with water systems, utilities, people on payroll or getting paid, or also paying their bills. Those are also the other concerns that we would have. And that's why it's so important to make sure that we're planning for that.
I mean, Ashley, I'm curious, with the pandemic, what role did your emergency management office play during the COVID-19 pandemic? How were you involved in the response to that? Because I'm sure that was also a unique new challenge and something looking forward. How would things be different if we go through another new pandemic?
Yes, so it's very similar to kind of what I was saying. So obviously public health and our public health agency partner is the subject matter experts in infectious disease. They actually do a lot of emergency management planning and a lot of preparedness on their own set. So we're very accustomed to working very closely with them, not only for preparedness for pandemics, but also for response. And so I actually worked in 2 different jurisdictions during the COVID pandemic, and primarily our emergency management offices in both of them served more as that liaison role. We really worked a lot in logistics, so trying to order the supplies they needed, providing them PPE stuff, whatever they needed, and then also working in that EOC management role. So once again, coordinating logistics, coordinating communications, trying to get everybody in the same room, sharing the same information and singing from the same sheet of music. But yeah, I mean, really like organizing a lot of logistics and ordering masks and doing that was a lot of our role.
All right. So we talked a little bit about stakeholders, continuity of government. And some of these things are obvious even to the people who aren't deep into this, police, fire, medical, infrastructure. Those are the things that I think of the most. Are there any other things that people take for granted that you have to manage in a situation like this, besides those big time things that I just mentioned?
I would say definitely too our social services programs, as well as even our libraries. So our county, and I know other counties around the country, have different programming every day to help put out food resources, other kind of family aids and assistance. And then too, our libraries has really great programming with internet access and like job fairs and things like that. And so we like to work with them and make sure that they're plugged in to our response and our recovery planning, because it's really essential for our community that they're able to also continue their services, either during a cyber interruption or any kind of disaster interruption, because obviously we have a lot of vulnerable population who rely on their services. And we want to make sure that we can provide that, because we know through disaster history that disaster hits vulnerable populations harder. And we want to focus on making sure to maintain those services.
And then Ashley, I have a quick 2-part question for you. The first, and I'm sure there's probably multiple ways you could answer this, but if you had to pick just one, what is the biggest challenge that you face? What do you think is the most challenging part of your job? But then also the second part of that question, what do you think is the most rewarding part of your job?
Ah, man, that's a tough question. Biggest challenge, I think, for emergency management as a field is, like I keep continuing to mention, we have so many evolving and emerging threats. And so because we have evolving and emerging threats, we really have to stay on our toes. We constantly have to continue to train, update stuff. We have to really be proactive in our field, because if we try to treat disaster response the same as 10 years ago, it's just not simply going to cut it. So I think making sure that we maintain our awareness and our knowledge in the emerging threats, and making sure that we have a capacity to update plans and build capability in government. I will also throw in there, obviously, I think staffing always is a concern in local level emergency management, pretty much everywhere you go. I think that it is a challenge to stay on top of emerging threats, and then also do emergency management in the way that we need to do it with only a handful of staff. So until we really invest a lot in our local level emergency management through local government funding, it's going to be a challenge to really be ready for the emerging threats. And then lastly, I will just throw out and say, I do think it's a challenge that our field does not have any kind of career definition of, training, standardization, or anything like that. Because of that challenge, we have emergency managers that are very different, might come from different backgrounds, different training. We have no current training requirements for emergency managers to maintain their information or their knowledge for emerging threats. And that I kind of see as a huge issue, because we need to really ensure that our emergency managers who are in charge of protecting the public are staying on top of the emerging threats and understand what they do. So that's kind of a short list of 3 items. As far as, I think the other question was success, right? Or
the most rewarding part of the job, maybe a little bit on a more positive note. What do you find to be the most rewarding aspect of it?
Rewarding, yes. I am one of those people that always looks at the cons before the pros. So rewarding, I will say, especially for anyone who's looking at emergency management, it is really, really community driven. And I absolutely love this job. I think that it is so rewarding to be able to help people, be there for your community in some of the darkest days, make a difference, and then also just serve with a servant heart. And so despite long hours or any of the challenges that we have in our profession, I always think that it's probably the most rewarding thing, being there for people and being able to help people.
Well, back to that a little bit. What made you decide to go in this direction anyway as a career? I mean, you've got the background in geosciences. What kind of pushed you toward this direction in your career?
So I was actually in graduate school in atmospheric science, and I just started in my first semester. And I always had the dream of being a National Weather Service forecaster ever since like second grade. But getting up there, I'm going through the schooling, and we had a lot of recent incidents in the 2010s. So if we remember Tuscaloosa, if we remember Joplin, if we remember a lot of these disasters where we really did a great job forecasting and we really did a great job issuing warnings with lead times and things like that, but we still had a ton of weather-related fatalities. And what really drove my interest in weather and wanting to do National Weather Service was to protect people. It was that life safety aspect. It was the telling people to seek cover. And I had this realization in grad school that, I can study all of this atmospheric physics and all this numerical weather prediction and all of this, but if I have a perfect forecast and a perfect warning, but people don't have resources, they don't receive the warning, they don't know what to do, we will never save them. We will always have storm-related fatalities. And so something clicked in my brain that day that I needed to look into emergency management, because I knew I could push for more basement access, like in Lubbock, Texas, where you kind of need basements out there, or push for better alert systems, take a assessment of whether or not siren systems are effective, taking a look at iPods and wireless emergency alerts, and then also having an ability to issue evacuations. All of those things resided in emergency management. So as soon as I found that out in my brain, I switched over and finished my master's actually in GIS and geography, and have fallen in love ever since. And I'm really, really glad that I switched over to this field, because once again, it's so rewarding, and it is a really great place to apply weather, but keep people safe, just like I always wanted to do when I was a kid.
And then Ashley, if somebody's listening to this and is, getting intrigued by emergency management and wants to become a part of the field, especially if it's, someone, I guess it could be at any level, but let's say it's someone who's, just entering college right now. What would be the best major for them to have? What would be the best way to prepare to go into emergency management? I know there's kind of multiple avenues, and you discussed that might be one of the challenges right now, but in your opinion, what is the best path you can take if you want to get involved in emergency management, as far as degrees and the kind of training that you need if you want to be a successful emergency manager?
That's a great question. So depending on your region, some regions really want to hire emergency managers with degrees. Some regions don't want to hire anybody with a degree, and they prefer first response experience. So I would definitely say, if you have a certain region that you're interested in emergency management, or you think you might go, you might want to do research and see whether or not they would want a degree there or not. Since I kind of mentioned this before, am heavily pushing for data-driven, proactive solutions and things like that. So I would say getting a degree would be a really good idea. Taking a look at different emergency management programs, but also STEM. So there are GIS programs that could really get you in, geography, any kind of atmospheric science or earth science would be helpful. Environmental science, there's a lot of environmental relations to emergency management. But pursuing that degree, and then also making sure that you're not overweighting your grades as the solution of getting a job. I made the mistake of not doing an internship in emergency management, and it was very challenging coming out of school, not having any of that. So I always like to tell people to reach out to local level emergency management offices, try to either shadow, meet them, get in that office, get some kind of internship volunteer experience. And then lastly, I am going to say, because this field is so closely related to public safety, it is important to at least have kind of a fundamental understanding of how emergency services works with police, fire, EMS, dispatch. So if you're interested in volunteering for a fire department or something like that, that will really give you a cutting edge coming into the field, especially in those areas that don't have an established emergency management educational pathway for hire.
Yeah, that all sounds like excellent advice in a field that continues to rapidly evolve, and everybody's in different parts of the country are going to have different requirements for their emergency manager, whatever their hazards may particularly be. Ashley, thank you so much for spending time with us this afternoon. Where can people find you online in addition to the Baltimore County Emergency Management?
Sure, yeah. So I am addicted to Twitter. So you can definitely find me on Twitter at Miss Ashes92. I actually only talk like disaster, meteorology, weather nerd stuff, because that's kind of my one niche place where I can share that information and not annoy my other friends and my family. So you can chat with me on there. I also have a LinkedIn just at Ashley Morris, and then you can search me there. And then, yeah, I think that's pretty much it.
Ashley, thank you. Wonderful. And check out what she's doing there in Baltimore. She's a great spokesperson for the community. We've seen her in Richmond. She's come down to a couple of conferences down here and been a wonderful ambassador to the emergency management community. So Ashley, thank you again for joining us on the Across the Sky podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so fun talking.
All right, Matt and I will be back with a few closing thoughts in just a moment.
Make a difference. Relish a great work-life balance. Enjoy generous benefits and competitive pay. Go home each night feeling fulfilled by your work. Work for an employer of choice. Work for Blue Ridge Hospice. We're always looking to hire compassionate RNs, CNAs, or anyone interested in office or thrift shop work. We've been your not-for-profit community hospice since 1981. Visit our website for more information or to apply today at blueridgehospice.org. That's blueridgehospice.org. Blue Ridge Hospice is an equal opportunity employer.
And welcome back to the Across the Sky podcast. I'm meteorologist Sean Sublett from the Richmond Times-Dispatch with Matt Holliner, serving our Lee Enterprises locations from Chicago. Really nice conversation with Ashley Morris, the emergency management planner there in Baltimore County, Maryland. I think, that's one of the things that a lot of us take for granted. I mean, we know, you and I, the weather space, what kind of weather disasters can happen and where they're going to impact. But you and I are kind of fortunate that way that we can see some of these things coming before other folks, even though we try to warn people to the best of our ability. Then it's left to people like Ashley, who then coordinate with weather folks to try to get things back to normal, right?
Yeah, it's a big job. I mean, especially when there's some type of major weather disaster that impacts a place. I mean, the amount of moving parts and elements and the coordination that's needed leading up to it, just getting all those elements in place, like say for a hurricane that's about to make landfall, because obviously you want to keep people safe and, but at the same time, you're planning for the aftermath and the cleanup that's going to be needed. So coordinating those resources and getting those in place, the amount of planning. And I think the biggest challenge for that job seems to be a challenge for many jobs, is the communication, trying to get the uniform message to everyone and making sure all your bases are covered. I bet that, she mentioned some of the challenges, but I bet the communication part is one of the biggest challenges. I mean, especially, in this day and age, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, where everything was having to be done virtually. You couldn't just get everybody in a room together, for example. That would probably be a best situation. But now you've got people in various different locations and trying to get them however you can, on phone, on Zoom. So I imagine just the coordination that's involved, before an event, during an event, and after event. It's just one heck of a job.
Especially,
so I really respect her for the amount of work that must involve.
Yeah, especially in these places that have higher populations, right? Or places that, or low populations, but a wide ranging area of responsibility, or some kind of combination of both of those. It, trying to figure out, where are my resources? Where do they need to go? When do they need to go there? How quickly do I need to contact them? What holes do I have to plug? All of that stuff. It's no wonder they spend so much time planning, planning for this situation. Let's put this exercise together. Let's plan for this situation, because some things are going to happen. If you're in Baltimore County, there's going to be some flooding. I'd imagine that's the most obvious thing in a place like Baltimore County, flooding. But, they're going to be susceptible to a tornado, right? They might be susceptible to, fire or other things as well. So it's got to be a challenge, and you've got to have an imagination of what other things can go wrong. I think that's one of the things that makes me think about the most. I mean, you've got to, what kinds of things that maybe I don't know about that can go wrong, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think she was saying, I see the cons first, but you almost have to in that job. Think about what's the worst case scenario, and are we prepared for that? And if this happens, then what do we do? And then if this happens, what do we do? So but that's what you need beforehand. If you want an effective response and you want things to run as smoothly as possible and help as many people as possible, you got to think about these worst case scenarios and all the what ifs. So that's why I can see you can almost be a little bit pessimistic in that job, but you have to be in order to be prepared. And I think she was trying to get the point across that it's probably time that in some of these, especially rural counties, with just the increase in severe weather we're seeing, places that didn't see severe weather as frequently in the past, it's happening more frequently now. And so I think some of these smaller places in particular, I think you're seeing it ramp up in cities, but smaller communities are experiencing extreme weather more often too. So I think you're getting to a point where these places that might only have one person on staff, that's not going to cut it anymore, especially if you want to be prepared for something really big that impacts your county. You need to increase the staff, increase the training on those staff, because things have only been getting more and more wild. So yeah. I think that's it's an evolving field, just like meteorology is. You're trying to adapt to the change in the weather that we're seeing. Emergency managers are right there with us in all of this.
On top of that, as you mentioned, we've seen the last 2.5 years how things cascade. Not only do you have the weather problem, but then you have the weather problem in a pandemic where highly transmissible disease. So, how do you manage that? How do you manage people in shelters when you're trying to shelter away from bad weather, but at the same time, you've got disease transmission? So it is an unenviable task, and one that may sometimes be thankless, but very glad we have sharp people doing this good work. Okay, so with that, I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up for this week. Matt, any final thoughts there from Chicago?
No, I just, he's talked about it from the beginning. I just hope, after talking about emergency management, being prepared for events, I hope hurricane season stays quiet. If this ends up being a below average season, that's okay. We've had plenty in 2020 and 2021. So I'm okay for 2022 to be quiet. Knock on wood. Yeah, more than enough the last 2 years. So again, we're recording this on September 1st. We had Danielle just formed, so we'll see where it goes from here, because as we all know, September is the climatological peak of hurricane season. So with that, we'll wrap it up for this week. For Matt Hollander in Chicago and in absentia, our friends Joe Martucci and Kirsten Lang, I'm meteorologist Sean Sublett from the Richmond Times-Dispatch. Thanks for joining us on the Across the Sky podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Make a difference. Relish a great work-life balance. Enjoy generous benefits and competitive pay. Go home each night feeling fulfilled by your work. Work for an employer of choice. Work for Blue Ridge Hospice. We're always looking to hire compassionate RNs, CNAs, or anyone interested in office or thrift shop work. We've been your not-for-profit community hospice since 1981. Visit our website for more information or to apply today at blueridgehospice.org. That's blueridgehospice.org. Blue Ridge Hospice is an equal opportunity employer.